I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library for Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is Cathey Steinberg, longtime member of the Georgia House of Representatives, a state senator, and an advocate. Welcome, Cathey.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Kingston, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, which is part of Luzerne County. It's northeastern Pennsylvania, and it's a small town out of another small town across the river of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And it gets very cold up there. It's in the snow belt, and it's an old mining town, which I grew up with, and then the mines died out, but it was a whole different environment. And so, of course, like many of us, we couldn't wait to move out of. Should I look at you or him? Oh, okay. Anyhow, we just couldn't wait to move out of there. And then in 77, 78, before I ran, it was, I don't know if before I ran, there was a terrible, terrible flood in Pennsylvania, and everything dumped into the Susquehanna River. It's at that point the worst flood in the history of the United States. And it was so bad that cemetery stones came up and everything landed in our backyard, among others. And so the whole town had to be rebuilt. At that point, my parents sold their house to my first cousin, who was about my age and had 3 kids, and their house went completely under. They were in like a valley, and then decided to move to Atlanta. I was shocked, but they came because they had to get out, and we had just decided, my former husband and I, to stay in Atlanta. Him being from Pittsburgh and me being from Wilkes-Barre, we liked the climate. Mm-hmm. I was much more concerned about moving south, I have to admit. And because I think I'm a Yankee at heart, or I was. I'm much better at being Southern now, but big change. And that was we moved in the 60s. And Atlanta is not what Atlanta is now. Even when I came, and Buford Highway was 2 lanes. Mm-hmm. I think the only ethnic restaurant besides fried chicken they had was this one Chinese restaurant on Buford Highway. We were just talking about it the other day. It was like 1 room, and eventually it moved, I think, to Piedmont, but it went out of business. And I just, I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, but we went to Philadelphia, we went to New York, and I just could not get over Atlanta. I couldn't. It's very sad. And I remember, I know you may not believe me, but on our radio, listening to the radio on the way down, we heard hog calls and stuff on some of the stations. I'm like, oh my God, who am I? What am I doing here? Yeah. But we went, and my husband, former husband, was a medical resident here in cardiology. What happened is he was in Philadelphia doing an internship, got drafted, as doctors did, because it was during Vietnam. I know, ages of me. And so he came in as a captain, and we went to New England. And I loved it because we skied, we had a nice house, which we didn't have, but he was terrified for 2 years that he would be drafted, and he wasn't. But we got to know New England really well, and they would have built an office for him to stay up that way. They really would have. But so we went, and then we went back to Philadelphia. We did a lot of traveling around, and there was a reason I was going to say it, and I forget already. Well, anyhow, we went up there and then came back to Philadelphia, and then came to Atlanta to do the fellowship. Mm-hmm. So he was down here at Emory, and he wanted to come because a doctor named Willis Hurst had just written a very well-known book called The Heart, mm-hmm. and that's how he made the decision. Mm-hmm. And so we were here after 1 year. He loved it because it was warm. Yeah.
I was going to ask you the question of whether or not you came to Atlanta for business, career, or weather.
Right. Well, it was a combination of, as it was in those days, his career, his business, and his appreciation of the weather. And I understand, because as a cardiologist in those days, he had to go out a lot at night. Today they find somebody else to do it. And but it wasn't for me. I mean, you know, those days you go wherever your husband goes. And so I cried for about 5 years. And then I did some work in adoption and things like that, but on a fluke, a friend of mine who doesn't live here now recruited me to run for the legislature against George Petro. And I said to her, I can't run. I have no experience, and who's going to carpool my kids? I mean, that was just the bottom line. And I thought she was, you know, what's she talking about? So after, coincidentally, I had a car. This is an unimportant story, but significant in my life.
This is a station wagon story.
Have you heard me? How do you know all this?
You've told me.
Really?
Yeah.
Boy, you have a good... Anyhow, yes, I had a station wagon that I couldn't get any two appliances to work without it going dead for about a year. I mean, you have to carpool. It's very, you know, all that stuff. So finally I got myself a new station wagon, and I think within the first week, I was doing some part-time work in international adoption. I was coming back through Corporate Square, and a woman ran a stop sign and slammed into me. And fortunately, I wasn't hurt, and the kids weren't in the car. But all I could think of is, oh my God, how am I going to carpool my kids? Oh my God, I got this new car, how am I going to carpool the kids? And I went into the phone booth to get the babysitter to stay, and I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to carpool the kids? And then I sat there, and I really mean it, and I said to myself, God tells me through this accident that I love my kids, but I need to do something else besides carpool. And of course, I didn't know it then, but God was a she, and we didn't know that in those days, but obviously she was. So I came home and I said to my husband and kids, who are all sitting there waiting for dinner, I said, thank God nobody was hurt, but I was in a pretty bad accident with my new car, and by the way, I'm going to run for the legislature, in one sentence. Of course, my kids didn't know what it was, and my husband's looking at me like, well, where's dinner? I mean, they didn't know what to say, and I didn't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. You know, my friend who was recruiting me, I said, Paul, I can't do this. And she said, it's just 40 days a year and $7,000. That's all. And I'm like, oh, $7,000, that sounds like a lot. This was in 1976. And 40 days, I can do that. Well, you know, as we all found out, it stayed $7,000 for several years, and became increasingly more than 40 days. Didn't know a thing. And I admitted 10 years after I got elected that I had never been to the state capitol before I signed up. So ignorance is bliss. What do I know? You know, I figured this will be fun. I was so restless and bored. And so I ran in House District 46 in the House. And it started pretty much down right where DeKalb and Fulton connect, off of Lenox Road, up Buford Highway. I take that back. And I was in the same apartment complex as the guy I ran against, who had warrants, or whatever they call them, on his door telling him if he didn't pay up, he'd be out. But anyhow, and it ran up to Ashford Park, which is on the edge of the Dunwoody area, and very Republican at the time. But I worked very hard, and I walked every house, and then I had two other people in the primary, and then my friendly volunteers, none of them knew anything, but knew how to talk on the phone. They would call the people I met, and I would call the people I didn't get to meet, and we had little index cards, and we knew everything about everybody we met. And so, believe it or not, we won the primary, and in Georgia it has to be over 50% without a runoff. And then people began to say, who's this Cathey Steinberg? I mean, they're like, where did she come from? And but by virtue of doing that kind of campaign, I really got to know the district well, particularly the Democrats. But I went to key Republicans that I was told were key leaders. And by the end of my 10 years there, 77, or was it longer than that? I forget. But anyhow, that the Republican district was voting for me more than some of the other districts, so I was very happy about that.
So you get to the Capitol in 1977.
Right.
When the House of Representatives was overwhelmingly male,
Right.
white, and mostly rural.
Right.
What was your first reaction?
Oh my God. Who am I and what am I doing here? But the thing is, what I learned later is that people, if you act smart and you're a Yankee, Democrat, and Jewish, they think you're smart. I mean, you don't have to know a thing, but, you know, they think you're smart. And I found that out over the years. One of our nice rural guys said to me about 8 years after I was in there, how come you Jewish people are all so smart? Honest to God. But I gave him a serious answer. And then he was a guy whose father was in the legislature, and none of them would talk to me. They were scared. And then a lot of them would come up and they'd look at me and they'd say, do you know Bella Abzug? She was an old feminist that probably a lot of people don't know now. And assuming, and she was really New York congressman with big hats, and assumed that because I was in the legislature, I therefore knew every Jewish woman of any note in the whole world. And they would kind of look at me, and I always felt they were looking to see if I had any horns. But or Gloria Steinem. And very shortly after I came in, they were calling me Cathey Steinberg. And not necessarily on purpose. But Gloria Steinem was the big woman then, and that's what they called me. So, and there were a handful of legislators that would never vote with me no matter what. If I voted and said today is Tuesday, they'd vote no. Just enormous distrust. And then I also sat through our preacher of the day, every day, and Sidney Marcus, may he rest in peace, and I sort of had a pact, and we would go up to the preacher, and we would, if he didn't pray in Jesus' name or too much of that, we would say, thank you for your consideration. They didn't know what we were talking about. Or we would go up and say, we enjoyed your sermon, but by the way, we're Jewish. And they looked. And we just did that as a matter of trying to do something. But there were several years that I was the only Jewish person at the time. When Sidney died, Mike Nichols left, and the guy from Columbus, I forget, he moved. So there were several years that I was the only Jewish person. And there's definitely, I didn't realize it because I grew up in a small town, and I went to a Methodist school, and it wasn't cliquey, like Jewish, like some of the bigger cities. So I was like, what is going on here? And, the preacher would say something to me, and everybody would look at me. I mean, it's like, I'm like, it's okay, it's okay. It was funny. It was an education for all of us, for me and for them.
How many times were you called little lady or honey or girl?
Yeah, I'm still called that.
Before you got the attention of your colleagues?
Well, I was called that a lot, and it used to bother me, because that's not where I came from. But then I realized it's the culture. And the other thing that happened is a friend of mine who you know said to me one day, Cathey, it might help you if you were a bit friendlier, because they're sort of unsure of you. And if Henry Reeves comes over and says, hi, Miss Cathey, you need to be nice to him. I said, oh, because I was raised where you don't talk to people you don't know well. And I said to her, why would he want to talk to me? I mean, that's how I was raised. Don't talk to strangers, and you don't go patting people on the back. And so I had to learn to let that roll off and then enjoy it. And I did. It made me, I think, a friendlier and a nicer person. I'd say that. And when I would have people down to help me, I would warn them, because I know that most of the people I know are not used to that at all. And that was a real learning curve. Anyway, as I became nicer, friendlier is a better word, they became friendlier and they began to trust me more, I think. So it's a two-way street. It's not like who is she, and I wasn't who are they, kind of thing.
Tom Murphy.
Well, Tom Murphy come walking in with his cowboy hat and his cowboy boots and cigar hanging out of his mouth, and tall and those days, spitting tobacco. We used to do that. The first 2 days we were there, and they were calling roll. I had no idea. I couldn't, like an auctioneer. I'm like, what did he say? And I talk fast. What did he say? Just push this button. I mean, they're all pushing buttons, and I'm still trying to figure out what he said. So it took me a while to kind of get the flow. And not that I don't talk funny to them, but I just had no idea what was going on. And it took us, I'd say 3-4 years to, at least to kind of connect. Because one of the first bills I did, the second year there, I and several others, but I was became the key leader, was this anti-rape legislation. There shall be no conviction unless there's, well, bottom line is there shall be no conviction unless there's a witness in rape. We were the last state in the country not to repeal it, and you can't count on a witness, for rape. It's usually done that. Well, Murphy apparently hated it. Over the years, it'd come up several times. But we did a big campaign. The media got behind us and everything like that. And I managed to get it on the floor when Randy, the big heavy guy from Middle Georgia.
Carl.
Yeah, when he was out. He almost died. So, and we had to get a bunch of people not to come to the Judiciary Committee. And we got a lot of press, and Mr. Speaker was not a happy camper. But we won. I mean, we passed the bill. It had already passed the Senate, and he's, like this. But after that, it sort of passed over. He said, we have to live with them. I might as well. But I think before that even, I found out that there was no ladies' room. As I walked into the men's room, it says members only, right off the anteroom of the thing, and I opened the door, and there's everybody on the standing and having fun and conversation. I'm like, oh, what am I doing? And I came back, and where's the ladies' room? Down the hall. So we had none, and it was a big, big to do. And then I think we had Fran Hester, who was a reporter, took pictures of standing in line in the public ladies' room behind all these kids and people saying anti-ERA people and all that. And finally, we kept telling the speaker. And then every time I had to go to the restroom, I went up front and said, Mr. Murphy, I got to go use the restroom. Go use mine. And, that went on long enough. Finally, he said, okay, get the ladies of the House out to the anteroom. And he says, stop pestering me. I'm giving you a toilet, a restroom. So they divided it, and we had one restroom, toilet, and one sink. Mm-hmm. Well, that was the most important thing I did in about the course of 2 or 3 years, is getting that ladies' room. And I heard they now have 2. I don't know. But that was really, that was symbolic, because I knew it was we were there to stay. And he kind of knew that. And when he would get angry at me, which was not uncommon, he would say out loud one time, if you're not careful, I'll take away your ladies' room. Kind of thing. So, but we just smiled.
How did he treat you in the way of committee assignments?
Well, after the passage of the rape bill, I wanted to get on the Judiciary Committee. I was not a lawyer, but I was concerned about women's issues and divorce and families, and I wanted to get on the Judiciary Committee, which I tried to do for at least 10 years. Other people, Betty Jo Williams, people like that, they just got right on. Not me, not me, not me. Finally, after about 10 years, I got on the Judiciary Committee and the Rules Committee. I must have done something right that year, but it took a long time. Meanwhile, everybody that came in with me was either chair of something or on these committees. So those days, you kind of paid a price. And that's the way things were done then. And I think also, he didn't trust me, and I can't imagine why, but just didn't. When I came down to Augusta in those days, when the Forestry Commission had the retreat, or maybe they still have it, I don't know. Finally, I and some other, we decided just to come. There were no women even invited. Well, they were invited, but no women ever came. So a couple of us came. The first thing the speaker said to me is, well, did you bring the media? Did you bring the TV cameras? Like, she's trouble. She's trouble. And we didn't. You know, we had a good time. So it was a concern about lack of trust, because I did get a lot of media coverage. I was unique in those days. I mean, somebody actually came over and took a picture of my family having breakfast. You know, it was unique. Of course, we'd never had breakfast, so I had to pretend. But that was, you know, so unique being a woman with kids, because like Eleanor Richardson came in, and she was much older. Well, she's probably what I was then, but she didn't have any children at home, and Betty Clark. You know, the standard family was Grace Hamilton was sort of unique. Mm-hmm. And I still remember, because I made my kids all get ready, and we all sat at the table, and I had plates. And then when I look back to after they put it in the paper, we had nothing on no food. You know, my family fended for themselves. But anyhow, and then the other exciting thing to me in the beginning was going to the breakfasts. As a woman, I never went out for breakfast. I was home with my kids. And of course, it required a lot of organizing in my life. And I realized that, you know, it's men's timing. And then I got tired of it after a while. So, but anyhow, when I left the House in '88 to go to the Senate, no, I left the House to run for the Public Service Commission. Mm-hmm. When I took the well and spoke to everybody, I said, you know, I really learned a lot. It wasn't just me who was right by any means. I learned that most of the people here, they're the way, they're Georgians. And I'm a visitor in a way, or a guest, just new. And I really felt that it was, you know, I learned a lot, and I hope they learned something. So I was appreciative by the time I left the House.
Let's get back to your early years in the House. To whom did you look for guidance and counseling?
Sidney Marcus, most of the time, because he sort of looked after me. He's sort of that kind of guy. For people that aren't aware, he passed away at a very young age, 55, I think he was, from cancer. The year after he was running for mayor of Atlanta, and it was just horrible because he was so young. But I went to a couple parties. That's not all I did, by the way, but and that no women had ever gone to, and he went with me. I don't think he'd ever gone either, but he went with me. He really was like a big brother. And in terms of women, there were no role models. And when I finally decided to run, I think back and I said, well, when I was thinking, I said, if Marlo Thomas and Gloria Steinem, was it Marlo Thomas and somebody else, can run for public, it was Marlo Thomas and somebody else could run for public office, why can't I? That's all I knew. We didn't have role models of any significance when I came in. And it still fascinates me how much things have changed. I don't think they had any women in the U.S. Senate at the time. And, you know, the women's movement really kicked off in the 60s. And Betty Friedan's book and all that. So I was very much of an admirer of Virginia Shepherd. She did a lot on adoption, which was what I worked in.
This is state senator.
Yeah, state senator, and the only woman, I think, at that time in the state Senate. And so I was I thought she was really special. But in terms of women in the legislature, I really didn't have any role models. I mean, I like Grace Hamilton a lot, had a lot of respect for her, but there wasn't really anybody that I would go to and say, help me do this the right way. I learned the hard way.
You mentioned working on the rape bill. Let's talk about some of the other women's issues that you spearheaded.
Yeah, well,
you were really the spokesman for the female movement.
Yeah,
in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, it was a different climate when I came in. I mean, most people kind of only went so far, and then they backed off. The rape bill, anti-rape bill, put me on the map. And then I sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment, which had been around long before me. But I got about 17 legislators, and that started it. because they didn't know me well then. And of course, all of a sudden, I became the ERA lady, and I'm this raving liberal. And I'm like, who are they talking? You know, I'm driving a station wagon with 2 little kids, married to a doctor. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I figured I might as well play it up. And that was, Jimmy Carter got elected the year I got elected. And they're very pro-ERA, but they were panicked about it being in Georgia when he was about to run for re-election. And I don't think I ever lived that down. Not that I had never, years and years and years, people would say, there's the ERA lady. And I would say to some of the press, do you know anything else about me? Or the Yankee ERA lady. And, just unbelievable. But it wasn't easy. But also, one of the things we tried to do during this period of time is to work with legislators with certain style. We tried to train people because they were used to then a lot of aggressive, scary kind of women. And we made it our mind that we were going to try to behave, quote, behave. But it did work. And I think, of course, we didn't pass the Equal Rights Amendment, but I think there was some guilt, and therefore we had a bunch of stuff to pass after that. Domestic violence legislation. There was a huge divorce bill that actually the court struck down the one they had. We got that passed. I mean, it was really 90% easier to get things passed. Mm-hmm. And I think they were trying to make up with it. And I remember Larry Walker taking the floor several years later for the education bill for Governor Joe Frank Harris. And I remember him saying, I want you all to pass this education bill. I don't want to look back like I did when the ERA vote came up. I don't want my children to ask me, Daddy, why didn't you vote for the Equal Rights Amendment? I almost passed out. I wasn't in the legislature at the time. Mm-hmm. So I was glad to know at least people cared about it. But that's when it was an organizing tool. That's what I told people. It organized the women from across the state, many of whom I'm still connected with in some ways, and then gave us the strategy, move on. The Georgia Women's Political Caucus was, really became organized, and things fell into place even without the Equal Rights Amendment. Mm-hmm. And it was George Busby's last year, and he got Roy Lambert to be the second signer. And we got a whole bunch of people, but we couldn't pass it because Joe Frank was running.
As I recall, the amendment needs ratification by only 3 states.
Right.
At the present time. Do you think it'll ever pass in Georgia?
Debatable. I don't know what or if it will ever, if it will come up, because by the time it comes up, I assume it's going to come up like it's nothing. Like some of the others. We had a bill that said the husband is the head of the household, and the husband is the head of the household, and you basically said women have no rights and no access to property. It's a great 2 lines, but I can't remember. Finally, it took several years, and finally it passed, and it was just like another day. We had drummed it in, and finally they said pass, and that was it. And I think if the Equal Rights Amendment still comes around and they do it, it'll be like that. It'll be, why did we oppose it? Mm-hmm. Although when we were trying to get it out, I think a lot of people felt that they had committed to their districts that they wouldn't vote for it. I had several people say to me, I really wish I could help you, but I can't. And a lot of the things they predicted have come true. Women in the military, co-ed bathrooms. This is what we heard all the time. And they've come true, and nobody's the worse for it, for the reasons of the Equal Rights Amendment, many other reasons maybe. So I think if it does pass, I think people won't pay much attention, even though Georgia is one of those states that hates the federal government. And that's still pretty strong. Mm-hmm. They don't mind taking the money if it helps, the budget, but they don't want the federal government to have anything to do with us.
That's the old states' rights approach.
Absolutely. And I didn't even know much about that. Of course, when I came down there, I know a little bit, but how much it impacted people. And my being a Yankee and trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, I didn't understand a lot of it until we were kind of done with it. So it was a real educational tool. They just didn't that was the main thing they didn't like. They used it as a political wedge, but what do I know? I didn't. It's like they didn't have kindergartens. I thought it was a civil right to have kindergartens where I came from. And so there's a lot of assumptions that I made, but there's also a lot of assumptions they made about me. And but somebody just said, I can't remember. And when we had the snow last week, I can't remember. Somebody said to me that I couldn't believe it. This reminds me of when you were in the legislature and they had a snow day, and somebody got a hold of my Equal Rights Amendment bill and tried to kill it in Judiciary Committee because I wasn't there. But the State Patrol picked me up, and I came flying in and caught them in the middle. It was Rudy Johnson, and he went, I caught him. But since then, I learned never, always to be careful. And it was somebody that, out of the blue, I don't know, remembered that just last week. So obviously, it made an impact. I did a lot of family stuff too, like uniform child custody bill, which actually was requested by Phyllis Kravitch, who was a judge in Savannah. She's now federal. Asked me to do that through Tom Taggart. So that was exciting because she's so well respected, and it's a bill that has to get passed in every state, and so he helped me with it, and we got it passed, and did a lot of family. Well, removing the head of the household was huge, and so we just, did a lot of the domestic violence and when I came in, and I know you'll remember this, it may not seem like a big deal, but everything was a he. I remember Roy Lambert, okay, gentlemen, and I loved him. Okay, gentlemen, you have to listen to me now. I'm like, they're not life and death, but it's a culture. And I think not too long after that, and I think Tom Murphy was involved in it, Larry, they degendered the language. When they would write a bill, it would be either he or she or they or the legislators, and for the most part, it changed pretty much.
Do you remember what Speaker Murphy said about the Equal Rights Amendment?
About being... that
no one from his district had written a letter except one lady?
Well...
And she moved out?
No, but I also remember, I don't want to bring women down from the pedestal that they're on. And I remember stuff like that. However, when his daughter Mary, his little baby, when she began to teach school in Gwinnett County, she had so many kids that were getting pregnant and so many problems and everything. He adored her, and she really sensitized him to life with real women. And he became much more open-minded as a result of Mary. And also, I think two other daughters both got divorced and dumped on, I think. And they became sort of allies of us. They never would have before, and so it made it easier if his daughters could get to him. And he became more open-minded.
So after 12 years of being the ERA lady and the Yankee person, you decided to run for the Public Service Commission.
Right.
What prompted that decision?
Well, I kind of wanted to move on because the last thing that happened to me in the House is the governor created a zoning commission. Oh, yeah. And before I left the House, I sponsored a bill that created zoning laws for DeKalb, Fulton, and Atlanta. It was what do they call it? Local legislation, which we don't do anymore. And I was very lucky because the big developers went out for lunch, and they went, "Hey there, Steinberg." Well, we passed it when they were out for lunch. How funny. They hated it. And it went to the Senate, and Roy Barnes got up for me and passed it. And it was the only one. And when it went to the Supreme Court, it was challenged. Willis, what's his first? Such a doll. Willis, was that his last? Willis Hurt when they ruled on it in my favor, our favor, they named it the Steinberg bill. And so I thought, it's a big committee, that I should be entitled to get on that committee. No. Too much trouble. She's too much trouble. No. And I remember going into the governor's house, the then governor, Joe Frank Harris, and I shouldn't have done it, but I just slammed the door. I said, I can't do anything right. Slammed the door, and I said to myself, I do much better with the people than I do in this legislature. I can't move anywhere. And so there was an open seat. Oh, I know. That was the year I did the computerized telephone bill. And I got more calls and media coverage on that bill. It's a bill that would make it illegal for computerized telephone calls in Georgia, which was a major problem for us because we have the largest toll-free telephone district in the state and in, I think, many places in the country. But so I got very well known for that, and I decided, I think I'll run for the Public Service Commission. It'll keep me off the Equal Rights Amendment and off the whatever, and let me focus on some other issues that I could do. And I ended up running against Bobby Rowan. Whether he talked about it, I don't know. And it's an experience. I can't believe I even did it. I look back, but it was time for me to move on. And I did, considering very well. I was in a runoff with Bobby Rowan. And then I remember a friend of mine looked at it, and she knows South Georgia better than I do, and she said, oh, there's a runoff there, runoff there, runoff there, runoff there, runoff there, runoff, and there's you. Nobody else had a runoff. And she said, you can't win the runoff, because they're all down here with the sheriffs and all that. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to come down and do a debate with Bobby Rowan in Albany. I won Albany, believe it or not. And he wouldn't do it with me. But to make a long story short, it was such a vicious campaign in the sense that he brought this guy in from Augusta. He used to be in Georgia, I think, and he's another state. You'd know his name in a second. With Georgia Power in their state, whatever that was called, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And ran the dirtiest campaign against me, all about my being Jewish and about being a Yankee and everything you could think of.
And the ERA lady?
And the ERA lady. And I went to college in New York, Carnegie Mellon University in New York, which happens to be in Pittsburgh. And it just was vicious. And there was a reporter who went into Georgia Power. I don't know whether he went under a different name or what. He got a lot of information about what was going on. They were not allowed to give to candidates, Georgia Power. But he got a lot of stories on a lot of people from Georgia Power. But they told him, the press then, that they couldn't release the story until the election. It was like really close election. And so the day that, the other thing is, what's his name? Bob Barr. He was a district attorney? Was he ever?
Federal attorney.
Federal attorney.
Yeah.
He would not let him, that's what it was, he would not let them release it. He had some kind of say-so, the stuff he had, the reporter, until after the election. That's what it was. Mm. And when it came out, which was I think the day of the election being over, we found, it was horrible. And it was, so what they did, Mike Bowers, Mr. Good Guy, of course, gave them a slap on the hand. Other people might have gone to jail. And they were able to make some kind of agreement with Mike Bowers. And they sent, what's-his-name, back to Alabama. And they paid a fine. And they were done. All this was done behind closed doors. No, I didn't know anything. I knew what they had done, but I had no idea they were negotiating a deal. And what really bothered me is Mike Bowers went as on the on a white horse. I'm Mr. Good guy, and we had a good relationship. I roasted some stuff for him, but they all had agendas, including Bob Barr. Little did we know, but they all had agendas, and so I think I really got dumped on there, but it didn't surprise me.
That's ethics.
Yes, and it was considered one of the dirtiest campaigns ever for people that knew. Just even Dick Williams wrote an apologetic sort of column about using my Jewishness and blah, blah, blah. So that was an interesting experience. And of course, Bobby Rowan became very difficult on the commission, which I loved. And they all kept coming to me, won't you run now? Won't you run now? I said, hell no. So I thought that would be something I could manage. Even though statewide, I don't know what I was thinking. But I did well in a lot of areas that maybe I wouldn't have expected. I thought it was a miracle. And that's how that happened. And then I stayed out a term. Yeah, and I had a business, like it's called Ahead of the Curve, and it was not a lobbying business, but it was a educational advocacy business, which was very successful. We didn't get rich, but it was successful. And then Pierre Howard decided to run for governor, so his Senate seat, Lieutenant Governor, his Senate seat became vacant. That was my Senate seat, which he'd had for 16 years. So, of course, I couldn't turn it down, and Mary Margaret and I discussed it, and I went and ran in that seat, and she ran in, I guess, my old House seat and all that. And I loved it. It was such an easy district, and I loved it. But then we did redistricting, and that was very political, not only in terms of race, but in terms of women and blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. And I was on the Appropriations Committee, and I went through all that stuff and tried to be fair. People like Sanford Bishop. I said, Sanford, are you running? No, I'm just, blah, blah. So I gave up. I didn't fight for some things because I wanted to be fair. Don't be fair. It doesn't work in politics. And so they all ran and won, and everybody asked me to run because we needed more women running. And so and my district was vacant, so to speak, but it was predominantly Republican. And so I left the Senate, and I ran for Congress against John Linder. I don't even know if I had a primary. Whoever it was insignificant. Oh, no, it was not insignificant. Bob Wilson, the district attorney, how could I forget, of DeKalb County, right. big, ran against me, and everybody thought for sure he would win. He's old line, DeKalb, district attorney, and then there's me, crazy ERA lady. But I swamped him, killed him. I didn't kill him, but I could have, because he was also, gave out such stuff you wouldn't believe, but he was done. He was done. And then I ran against John Linder. And it was really hard, for several reasons, aside from John Linder, but it was really a majority Republican. Borderline, but majority, but a lot of Republican issues. He went up into Gwinnett and Duluth and all those places, which now are much more balanced. People keep moving up. And so after that, although I loved my 2 years in the Senate, let me step back in that, which was really an experience because you kind of could move into more leadership than you could in the House because it was so big. And Pierre, and I love you dearly, Pierre, if you ever see this, promised me a chairmanship, which of course he didn't give me because I think the guy from Milledgeville.
Culver Kid.
What you doing giving her a chairman? What you doing, Pierre? Giving her a chairmanship. Of course, he backed out, and Culver subsequently died. But anyhow, and then also when I had the telephone bill, I think he's the one that took it and hid it in his drawer. And Zell, who I always thought was a good friend of mine, over the years, he changed a little bit. And he was one of my favorite people when I came in because he was sort of moderate to liberal, with the unions and all that. But the year I did the bill with the telephones, he adjourned sine die the last night about 5 minutes early. Keep my bill off the floor, the computer. So I don't know who was behind him. I never did find out. But I was on the house. No, I was talking to Roy Barnes, and all of a sudden sine die, and we all went, what? They even had a picture of me and Roy in some of the papers. We were so stunned, but he did do that. And I know you can't imagine, but he did do that. But I had a good time that year, and it was hard for me to give it up, but I needed to move on, and I was divorced, and I needed to try to earn some money, and, I had to just have another life. And
So what happened after the congressional race?
The congressional race, after the congressional race, we had our business, and then Roy became governor. Was he the next one? Yeah, he was after Joe Frank, correct? So he became governor, and a year after he got elected, and I give him a lot of credit, he appointed me to be the consumer's insurance advocate for the state. And, I was amazed because nobody ever had the nerve to appoint me to anything. And it was probably poor Bobby Kahn who did it, even though everybody picks on him. I'm pretty loyal to him. And so I said to Roy, how can I do this? I know nothing about insurance. You'll learn. John Beavis, who works in his law firm, is going to be your deputy. I hope you don't mind. And of course, he was wonderful. And that was my favorite job. I loved it. And I did not expect him to lose. So I had the chance to be involved with the legislature, be involved with public policy, and believe me, they needed it, and to actually earn money and not have to run. But then I was in 3 years, he was 3 years I had the job. And I remember we were hiring somebody in the last year, and this woman said to me, what'll I do if Roy loses? I said, he won't lose, don't be ridiculous. And she hasn't talked to me since. So that was like sort of an extension. It was a lot of fun. It was a good fit for me. And then he lost, and then I left immediately. I mean, Ox and I hated my being there. And then Perdue, who I got along with very well in the Senate, he was real friendly to me the first week. Then they must have said, don't be friendly with her. He never talked to me since. And I eventually got dumped by Hank, what's his name, the budget guy who used to be with George Busby and everybody. But he left. He was working with Perdue at the time. You would know him in a minute. But anyhow.
Hank Huckabee?
Yeah. And he said, Cathey, I'm sorry to tell you. He just felt so bad for me. And I never could get in to see Perdue. I didn't ask for an appointment, but I thought it would be courteous. Could never get in to see him to this day. So then I don't know if I took a year off or not. And I ended up working for the Juvenile Justice Fund, which is pretty big. I mean, it deals mainly with runaway girls and I forget the right term. These were young girls who were raped or whatever, and we had a home. Juvenile Justice Fund had one of the only homes in the state for about 12 kids, Angela's house, and but it wasn't. It was too. I don't know why I did it, because I don't like to be a manager, and it was too managerial for me. And so, but I know what happened. I took a fair amount of time off. My father died and all this kind of stuff. And I was hesitant to go back into something I'd been at such a long time. But I made a big mistake, because I had 8 years for health insurance, which I still have. And I just needed 10 years to get a pension. I get a pension, $400 and some a month. I don't want anybody to think that I'm taking advantage of the state. But to be honest, if I would have been in a few more years, being that I was working at a high salary, I would have had something to fall back on. And so I worked for the Juvenile Justice fun for a while, and we mutually agreed to part. And I had, they said my father died and all this, my mother had died, all this kind of stuff. And so my husband, who's older than I am, retired, we began to travel. We always traveled, but we traveled. And we've done a lot of that. I mean, almost around the world completely. But so we've just taken advantage of that. And I was doing some consulting, and still occasionally would do that. But I kind of learned how to be retired. Not too bad. And I love doing things like this, but not having a daily commitment. I would never work full time again, hopefully.
Let me ask you a question about reapportionment. It seems that every time that Georgia reapportions its legislative and congressional districts, the outcome is a result of whoever happens to be in office at the time. Do you think there's a fair way to reapportion our state?
Well, I'd like to think it's fair to do it by non-legislators. But I don't know what is fair. Truthfully, I don't know if anything can be fair in politics. It's like the Justice Department. Every bill, every law having to do with race, elections and race, have to go through there. I think they still do to get approved. Well, when you have Republicans, they don't care. They'll either approve it or not approve it based on their political whims. And the same thing with Democrats based on their whims. I'm not being critical, but you can't get politics out of politics very well. Whether or not they would actually do it by a committee, like at the University of Georgia or something, is an interesting concept. But I don't know whether it'll ever happen. Something has to happen, because like my district was done mainly for the Republicans. It wasn't done for me, because I just decided, I don't know, there was too many black areas that would have been affected if I would have made a big fuss. Not that anybody would care. They certainly in those days didn't care about women. So you can see, and I was in for 2 reapportionments, and I can see the complexion change. A significant number of African Americans got elected, and then Republicans. I mean, look, they didn't all get elected. They got elected basically to start with on the districts. I mean, they what do you call it when they put everybody in one district to give them a Republican district. So the Republicans won't go in any other district. So those people will be there forever. And although it changes, when I came in, my House district was represented by Republicans. And aside from Jimmy Carter coming in, which gave me that little edge, they keep moving north. And when I was running for Congress, I'd be in Tucker, I'd see all these people that were from my district. They keep moving north, and I'm seeing that from the Gwinnett and Lawrenceville and Duluth and those places. They're all moving. I don't know where they're going exactly, but it's much more Democratic than it was when I ran for the Congress. So they do move, and you have a better chance. But I don't know. I don't know what the solution is, but it's certainly just very political, and it's not a very objective way at all.
In our case, the courts usually wind up with the final plan.
Right. But the final plan, will often have, just like now, and we had a bunch of districts that were pretty solidly Republican, a bunch of districts pretty solidly black, and then there were those of us in the city. We were sort of, we'll put them somewhere. We were kind of squeezed into the other districts. And I'm not blaming anybody. I'm all for, fairness, but it's tough. It's just tough.
Do you think race will always be a political issue in Georgia?
I think it'll be less and less. I mean, I look at the kids now, and I can't speak about the legislature because I don't know if they're fully representative of the people that they represent. But I look at kids now, high school kids, like at Lenox, they all come to Lenox and all that, and there's so many kids that are hanging out of mixed race that I just think It's gonna happen more and more, and I don't know how accepting grandparents. I just think it's going to happen more and more. A lot of these kids, you ask them, they don't quite know what you're talking about, which is a good thing. I've always laughed and said it's harder for like Jewish people than maybe African Americans, because they kind of have known over the years what they had to do with black. You know, whether they wanted to or not is another story. But the civil rights movement and the courts said, you have to do this, you have to do that, so they could blame it on somebody else. But it's forced, like schools and everything, it's forced a lot of mixing of races. But nobody's ever said you have to do that for women. I mean, if you do, you do, but nobody says, well, you need to put a woman on there. They're doing it more and more. There's more consciousness for women. I can't say that there isn't. But I think there's more consciousness legally of the courts and all that with races. I've always felt that. And I think it's happening. You know, I guess maybe what I think, and I don't know because I'm not down in the legislature now, but I think there's more acceptance of the races and more acceptance even of mixed races. But I think among a lot of older Georgians, they're still talking sort of behind their back. And that may be, and I'm not saying everybody, but I think it's hard to give up power. And I mean, I look at Atlanta with amazement, because when I came in, it was run by Citizens Bank, CNS Bank, I forget the guy's name, nice guy, and First National Bank. They were the big players, right? And I used to say this, every time I walked out of a door, I felt that somebody was talking about me. Not necessarily good, not, oh, isn't she great, in this city or climate. And now I look around and I see Bernie Marcus, the football, and that community is running this city, which is a big difference. I mean, they're Jewish, and it's a different cultural, and that amuses me to no end, because I remember when I always felt out of it. And I think that's one reflection of the change.
It seems to me that reapportionment has created black districts and white districts, and you no longer have the mix to which you referred. You will have a John Lewis district, which is totally black, and you'll have a North Side district, which is totally white. And therefore, you get into political ideology, and the issues become really moot, because in a Republican district, those people are going to vote Republican. It doesn't matter what the issues might be. And the same is true in John Lewis's district. Now, it doesn't seem to be a fair way to moderate politics and government in our state.
I think they're not maybe the greatest examples, because John Lewis has a lot of white people and Republicans, but he's our saint. Nobody would vote him out of office. And I love John Lewis, don't get me wrong. The white people, like the white Jewish communities there, they love him. I mean, they love him. And so I think he's probably not a black district like you'd find maybe in the South or something. But it's a lot of, in-town whites. I'm in his district. I didn't used to be, but with John Lewis is John Lewis. He's going to vote the best way he thinks, and he listens to people. I mean, he's very responsive, but they wouldn't tell him not to vote. And if he did, I think they have so much reverence for him. He's not, I don't mean this because he certainly is, but he's not, I'm trying to think of who he's not. He's not a typical person to, he can walk the walk and talk the talk no matter where he is. And who else did you refer to? Whites. Yeah, that they'll do, but they'll do it maybe, I think, more with Republicans versus Democrats. In other words, when they make white districts, they're not for Democrats, they're for Republicans. So it's a Republican, and I remember with the year, first time in reapportionment was Republican and black coalitions. So in-town whites like us, we were just on the outside. So I think it just happens that Republicans are white, most of them. And that's how they can gerrymander a lot of these people together. And they can't be found guilty too much because they have black districts. So I don't think it's a black-white as much as black-Republican. And if you look at the changes over each reapportionment, you're either black or Republican in Congress. Maybe you'll have that one guy down in Macon area who fights for his life.
Jim Marshall.
Yeah. And what's his name got it up in Athens, his old line family.
John Barrow.
Right. So,
who moved to Savannah because they
Right.
reapportioned him out of his
Right.
district.
Okay, there you are. Now, he has the liberty to do that. But it's not, I think there is a tendency to put everybody together. And I think one of it was not just to keep blacks in their place, but the courts. And, you know, if they wanted, in those days, you had to have a significant majority black district, whatever proportion was. So the best thing for them to do was to make it black and Republican, and then fit the other ones around.
Well, do you agree that that has almost eliminated the type of congressman we used to have, the compromising, moderate,
Absolutely.
Willing to compromise candidates that we had in Washington at one time?
I mean, Nathan Deal. I mean, I served with him in the Senate. He's off his loony. I mean, he might become president. Please forgive me if I'm not here and that happens. But I'm just stunned, continually stunned with how people will, in my mind, either maybe that's the way he always was, but how they'll sell out to get political power. I could never do that, which is why I'm where I am now. But, you know, he ran when I ran as a Democrat. And now he's this far to the right Republican. And so, you know, I was just going to, you were asking me a question. I'm trying to, tell me when. I think that the partisanship, however, is national too. It's not just Georgia. And it's a reflection of something, I'm not sure what. But I think if we don't get our act together, and I hope I'm wrong, we're in big trouble all over the country. Because everybody is very partisanship. And maybe it's having to raise so much money or to win, I don't know what it is, but I think we're a reflection of much of what happens around the country.
Cathey, if you will, let's go back for a moment to your role as the insurance advocate for the state of Georgia. What do you feel you accomplished in that job?
I think we accomplished a lot. We were certainly watchdogs for consumers with insurance issues or with regulations or legislation that was done by Oxendine. We very much were consumer oriented, and we got some good legislation passed. And it's interesting to me listening now to the debate on health care and insurance, because I'm sitting there going, and we did some of those things, like you can't go back and tell somebody after they've had had surgery that, well, no, now we're not going to cover you because you had a cold when you were 7 and you're trying to get your sinuses done when you're 55. That was not uncommon, and we had a lot of consumers call us, and so through the governor we were able, as part of the package, to get some good legislation passed. And I think even the insurance companies were okay. Well, no, they weren't really okay, but we were happy to do that. It's very important, and they're all coming to fruition in this discussion, not as far along, but in the discussion with the national public today. We also represented consumers, and Oxendine's office is very inconsistent on who they're going to help and who they're not going to help, and a lot of what they were saying when we came in was, well, your insurance company can help you with that. Well, it's in the law, your insurance company can help you with that. And then gradually, as we began to do a lot, they began to get better. Well, we'll try to help you. I used to feel that the first year or so, they would only try to help like doctors or people like that. And so I have to say, and I don't know now, but that they did try, because we just caught them on so many things. There was a rate, we got a chance to review rate increases, not for everything, but for a lot of subjects. And like there was something with Medicare and something else, I can't remember, but it affected the elderly. And they got big increases every year. And we said, no good, no good. And we, tied them down and kept that from happening. We worked a lot with small groups, 2 to 10 especially, which we have in Georgia, and their rates were going up 75%. And my deputy, John Beavis, who came out of Roy's law firm and went back, he's there now, and was brilliant, and what an advocate. And so he was able to pick up all these formulas, very complicated, so the average person can't understand it. And I'd be very surprised if John Oxendine could understand it, and would tear it apart about what they were doing wrong and get a reporter. So we did a lot. Mm-hmm. And our office grew, and we gave a lot of talks about, and did brochures and stuff on what to look for. People don't understand. It's a very complicated subject. And it always shocked me to find out what people don't know or don't understand. And that's part of the whole insurance issue, is education. And we did a lot of that all around the country. The state. And
do you agree with the President's suggestion that the insurance commissioner in Georgia should be appointed?
I've said that for a long time. I'm a little nervous now because the state's changing so much. You always feel confident when it's the leadership is with you on things. Mm-hmm. Like if it were me, I might have gotten appointed by Roy Barnes. Mm-hmm. Purdue would certainly not get appointed, and I don't know who would get that. But it's something to consider, no question mm-hmm. about it. There's too much money involved. There's too much business involved, and it's important that you have a fair and decent person, because mm-hmm. like anything else, you're regulating industry that you're taking money from mm-hmm. all the time, and that can't. And you also judge, at least in Georgia, you sit sort of as the judge when there's a lot of issues that come before the insurance commissioner. You can't have both. Mm-hmm. You either have another, what do they call those attorneys? There's a group of them that come in, they're independent, they work for the state. I forget what they're called, but they do stand in.
Administrative judges?
Yeah, and they do come into a lot of other departments, mm-hmm. but they don't in this one. So therefore, John Oxendine sits and rules and regulates over people that give him money and people that he regulates. Mm-hmm. And that, every time I would go, and we went to all of them, to make sure that we followed what was going on, and that's very, very scary.
Well, back during the Barnes administration, you were recognized as a member of his kitchen cabinet. Mm-hmm. What did you do as a member of his kitchen cabinet?
Well, I didn't cook, I'll tell you that. But, I loved it. It's so much fun, because I've always been on the outside, not on the other side. I've always been hanging out somewhere, but not with anybody. Although I always loved Roy, because he helped me a lot in the legislature. He's brilliant. Whether you like him or not, he's brilliant. And so it was fun to kind of be a part of what he was trying to do, rather than being the person that walked out of the room and knowing that the boys were talking about me. She's not as bad as we thought she was, that kind of thing. And so it was kind of fun to be part of the group and to be part of doing good things. And it was fun, just being part of somebody's birthday, being part of what I thought at the time was a very exciting, not perfect, exciting administration. I was mm-hmm. proud of it.
Well, speaking of Governor Barnes, let's go back to 2002. When he was defeated in his attempt to serve a second term. What happened?
Well, the first thing that happened is I don't think anybody expected it. I mean, we went to wherever the party was, I forget. And I was with somebody that we all know, and I can't remember. Nobody, when I walked in there, thought he was going to lose. And everybody tells me that his polls looked like he was going to win. So everybody was in shock. And a bunch of these lobbyists were saying, oh, I better leave and go to the other party. Oh, I got to go. You better go to the other party. And I'm like, oh my God. But I have some theories about that. And I know you can't eliminate, I guess, some of the things he did, maybe too aggressive or Bobby, whatever. But I think to some extent, politics is luck and opportunity. Like me. I came in with Jimmy Carter. You know, I was running against a guy who was not well liked or anything. But this is not the only thing, but one of the things is he was running against Guy Milner, who was running for the third time, I think, and he's a very wealthy Republican, not politically astute, and made comments about, I don't have to leave Atlanta to get elected. Remember, they used to say that. Mm-hmm. And also, I think a lot of Republicans, educated Republicans in that whole area, didn't like him either, for a lot of good reasons, and they liked Roy. He's out in Cobb County, he's county attorney or something, and they liked him. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a combination of Roy being very skilled and building up a lot of support and having an opponent who was going to give Roy the benefit of the doubt. Now, that doesn't say that he didn't deserve to win. I am not convinced that the teachers defeated him. I could be wrong. I am not convinced. Maybe they didn't vote for him, but I am not. Oh, this last time, I'm not convinced that the teachers voted him out of office and this kind of stuff. I think, Purdue probably fit the bill in some ways at the time that Roy didn't, and I don't think it's because Roy did anything bad, but I might be biased. I just think, the flag, okay. Here's Roy trying to do the right thing, right? There's Purdue saying, keep the flag, he shouldn't have done that. But push came to shove. Once Purdue won, there was no way he was going to do it. I mean, Roy did what he needed to do, but there's no way he was going to get an amendment, which is what he ran on. One, because he wouldn't get the votes in the House and Senate. Two, it became known that they would lose a lot of convention business. Shirley, frankly, well-liked mayor. There's no way, but he still used it as an excuse. So I don't think it had much to do with what the average person does, which is education and something else. I don't think people get defeated that way.
You think Roy Barnes can reinvent himself?
I'm less concerned about him running as a Democrat, because I think he could, unless, I learned one thing. Several things. You never know in politics. It's early, and what you think is one thing can turn out to be completely the other. Life is what happens when you're making other plans. I think he could be the Democratic nominee. I wouldn't guarantee it, not because I don't think he should get it, but there are some other decent people, and depends on, just like that whole thing with the teachers. That took a life of its own, or the flag took a life of its own. I'm still more worried about the Republican race, the general election, and I'm not sure. Depends maybe on who wins, and the state is kind of Republican right now, and I don't know what they're thinking of Obama and where it'll. It's when's the election? A year from 10 months from now.
Mm-hmm. To November.
Yeah, and I think a lot can happen. So I think it's more the November election than Roy himself.
Mm-hmm. Well, in 2004, as you know, the Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate. Were you surprised at that?
In Georgia? Yes. I mean, it's. Let me put it this way: I'm more fascinated by the whole thing. How it's changed. I'm sure you are. It's just amazing because it was how long? 100 years or something? I don't know.
137 years.
137. And, you know, everybody says, well, Roy, but I'm not convinced of that either. I mean, it's happening nationally. And so whatever the climate is, and that's democracy, it goes from one side to the other and it ends up in the middle. But, yeah, I'm not used to it. I look and see legislators now, I don't know a lot of them. I don't even know their faces. And it's just amazing to me that I'm so out of it. You know. And how many, you know what else? How many people change parties?
Mm-hmm. It's often said in Georgia, and I guess also around the South, that to be a Democrat is to be a liberal, and to be Republican is to be conservative. What happened to the middle of the road?
Right. Well, that I've always heard down here. And when years ago, my father's family were Republicans. Still amazes me because he's a big Democrat, but I think it was a different kind of Republican. They were fiscally more conservative, always socially liberal, or whatever, socially, like Mike Egan in many ways. I think he sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment many years ago. And he was more of middle of the road kind of Republican. Kill Townsend always put the welfare bill in. You don't see that today. And I don't know. Well, like Cathey Ash, she was like that. She left. There's not room for people like that to really fit in, and there were a lot more. And I thought maybe when there were more Republicans that they would moderate, but I haven't seen it yet, unless David Ralston, unless he does something to help that.
You hear some dissatisfied Democrats say that the state party is too liberal, too urban, too dependent on minorities and labor unions. Do you think that's a true statement?
Well, I don't know a lot of details about the state party. I mean, I just don't. But I think that's what they would probably say anywhere in the country. I mean, I see it in the columnists, I see it on the talk shows about the partisanship and the labeling. And I think that to some degree they're right, but the rest of it is just stereotyping.
Well, you've been a Democrat, loyal Democrat for a number of years.
Right.
What do you think's down the road for the Georgia Democratic Party?
Oh, I think they'll come back to power. Is that the right word? I think so. I don't think anything is ever permanent in politics, as I've learned. I really don't. And things can change 1, 2, 3. I mean, I don't know where Obama's going to end up. Here he came in with a huge mandate, and look at what they're doing to him now. And so I sit and I try to figure out whether he got elected for completely different reasons than what he has to do now. You know, he got elected, did he get elected because people's conscience, you know, he's a very good type, and I'm not saying that, African-American, he's very bright, he's a new face, and then when reality comes in, they don't want that. So who knows? I never thought an African-American would become president. I swore by that till the day he got elected. And now I'm like, well, see, this is what they really meant when you're seeing all this nastiness. But I don't think you can ever say ever with anything, including, most especially politics or party. They're back and forth and back and forth.
You think Georgia will ever elect a woman governor?
Possibly. It'll probably be Republican. Because here I looked at Jan Jones, is that her name? Jan Jones, the new president pro tem, or
Yeah.
I don't even know her, but I hear she's pretty nice. For some reason, Democratic women who are pretty loyal don't move up. I mean, and that's a topic of conversation. It's always seems to be Republicans or the other party. I mean, it's just very frustrating that the Democrats who feel pretty loyal just don't move much. There's never been a Democratic elected woman. And there's Kathy Cox now, and this one and that. No.
You know, I've noticed that every Georgia governor since Herman Talmadge, except for Lester Maddox, has served in the legislature. Do you think the legislature is a good training ground for a governor?
I think it is, but I don't think it's necessary anymore. I mean, I think that the voters are more diverse. I mean, historically, the governors all came from rooted counties or states or whatever. But that's changing so much. I mean, even in rural areas, I think people are moving out or people are moving in. Diversity of people, Mexicans, Indians, everything is very different, and I don't think that's going to require coming out of the legislature. No, I don't.
Mm-hmm. But as you look back over a very successful and meaningful career, what would you say has been your greatest accomplishment as a public official?
Well, one of the things I like to say is that I worked very hard to get the respect of the good old boys of the Georgia for women, not just for myself. And I found myself being aware of that after maybe my first term. And I was nice, but I said something even quietly to raise the awareness of and the respect of women legislatures. And that's one reason the Equal Rights Amendment, we lost, but I knew, or the rape bill, I mean, the fact that we went from getting slammed to getting it passed, not just me, but I worked very hard to try to get the respect of the legislature. I mean, I remember when I would go to like a Ways and Means for something, and I raised my hand, they'd say, "Now, what do you want, little lady?" But they don't do that now. They're used to women on committees. They're used to women businesses. They're used to, they're more used to doesn't ring a bell every time a woman sits anywhere, whether it's here. I mean, I watch television, I see these women newscasters, women being interviewed. It's changed a lot everywhere, but it's not easy here. And I've seen an enormous change. In terms of legislation and stuff, one of my most important bills to me, which we don't get talked about, it did at the time, was the Nursing Home Residents' Bill of Rights. And in terms of people, I always think of that as one of the most important pieces of legislation I sponsored. And it was not easy because in those days we had nursing home people on the committee, health committee, Billy Randall, that sweet guy from Athens. We had a bunch of them. And I remember Barbara Nivens. Do you remember her?
I remember Barbara.
Coming into the Health and Ecology Committee.
She was at TV.
Right. And she would zero in on anybody related to nursing homes, like Billy Randall. He sold his in the middle of all this. I mean, she went after them, and it's not perfect, but it was significant, and I still see this thing on the doors in the nursing homes requiring the Bill of Rights, and they still need a lot of help, being that I was in one for a couple months last year. I broke my pelvic bone, but that was very important to me. It was substantial, and so I always say that for some reason. But I like to think maybe in some way made a little difference with the zoning or the women. And
what's your biggest disappointment?
The biggest disappointment probably was, I guess, the Equal Rights Amendment in one way, but I think probably, I don't know how to say this, being so hard to become part of the team. And not at this point, it's hard. It's very hard. And when I'm in the House, I would look out and see women that I knew that were lobbyists, thinking, I said, oh, it's so nice to see a friend. I mean, it's hard to really have to push your way in. I don't know if I call it a disappointment, because I felt better as the years went on. And it was a disappointment not to win the Public Service Commission. Mm-hmm. it was a disappointment not to win Congress, but I was sort of relieved in a way because I didn't want to raise that money again, and it was a hard time. But I try to look at all these things as experiences, positive experiences. It's made me a better person, much more understanding of different people. I've had the pleasure of meeting huge numbers of people I would never know in my life, and I think it's exposed me to a lot that I wouldn't have been exposed to, and I'm very glad of that.
Did you once walk out on a national ERA meeting?
Yes. Oh my God, you didn't miss a thing. Yes, I did.
Tell us about it.
Well, boy, oh boy, who talked to you? We went up to Washington. I happened to be up there for something, I don't know, and they were having an ERA America meeting. And they were having the leaders of the coalition, which was that year Sherry Shulman and Joyce, who I love, but I can't remember her name. And I don't know. So I came in to listen. I mean, I didn't sit at a big table, I don't think. And next thing I know, the president, whoever that was then, said, "You can't stay, Cathey." I said, "Why? I'm the sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment in Georgia. You can't stay. This is only for leaders, non-elected leaders of the ERA in different states." And neither of the leaders in Georgia stood up for me. Neither of them. So I left, and I forgive, but I don't forget. And I said to myself, no wonder they can't win. Use your head. I mean, whose side are you on, idiots? I mean, that's what I was thinking to myself. You're not good old boys yet, or good old girls, if you can't learn how to, make the best of anything you can. Most sponsors probably don't want to be bothered to come. Do you think Roy Lambert would come? I wouldn't expect him to. But it was very personal to me. I had 2 daughters and all that, and so that was it. I learned a good lesson.
Finally,
uh-oh.
If you had it to do all over, a young mother of 2 children with a broken down station wagon, would you have decided to run for the legislature in 1976?
Absolutely. And I did have my parents, and I say that because my kids were 3 and 6 when I ran, and I asked, they would come down off and on, and I asked them if they would stay. They had an apartment. Did they ever have an, if they would stay while I was in the legislature. And I thought my mother would say, "What? Why aren't you, having dinner parties or something?" And they said, "Absolutely. You can count on us." And because otherwise I don't know what I would have done. And it's not easy to do with 2 little kids. But it worked out fine. And I had I had extra to do because I had a fire housekeeper in the middle who I think she was a Jehovah's Witness, so I wasn't worried, but she was kind of almost abusing the kids. And I always had my seat right next to the ante room where the phone was, because in those days we didn't use cell phones. But I always had somebody to look after my kids, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, good.
I just feel blessed and still amazed that I did it.
You've had a wonderful career.
Thank you, and I appreciate that.
Well, listen, Cathey, I want to thank you on behalf of Young Harris College, the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, for being our guest.
Thank you. And I hear Young Harris, that's Cathey Cox now, isn't it? There you talk about progress. Everybody wouldn't get that, but she should have won lieutenant governor, but that's a nice appointment. 10 years ago, 20, none of us would have ever expected that in a million years. So there is progress. I thank you.